Peace, hello, and hotep, everyone. Welcome to the Baruti Libre show, and I'm your host, Baruti Libre. For this episode today, what I'm going to speak about is the conflict in Ukraine and its geopolitical implications. Once again, I'm going to speak about the conflict in Ukraine and its geopolitical implications. Now, within the Ukraine, as we all know, there's a conflict going on, there are protests going on, and not only that, there are insurrectionary measures going on, to the point in which last month, Ukrainian President Yanukovych, he was ousted out of the country. He was ousted out of the country, of course, and the country is on the verge of being taken over by right-wing or ultra-right-wing nationalist extremists who are organized by the Organization of the Ukraine Nationalists, which is actually an organization which was founded by Stepan Bandera, who was actually a nationalist around the time of World War II, and he was involved with the genocide of the Polish people, and not only that, of the Jewish people, because he was aligned and affiliated by the Nazis. So that's what's going on right now within the Ukraine. Additionally speaking, if we want to look at Ukraine, it's a situation in which, within the Ukraine, going back to the Treaty of Poliaslav within 1654, in which the Rus civilization, which is now, modern day Russia, was actually a country which fortified and protected the Ukraine, going back to that time, centuries ago, against the Polish and Lithuania country, for that matter. But now, if we were to fast forward time, Ukraine has always been a country which wanted its own political integrity and political independence, even though it has a lot of cultural relations with Russia, going back to that time, if you want to take it to the Soviet Union time. So the thing is that once Ukraine was co-opted by the Soviet Union, going back to the early part of the 20th century, around the time after the October Revolution, of course, within the Soviet Union, should I say Russia, when the Soviets overthrew the Imperial Russian government of Kerensky. This was around the time which the Soviet Union began, of course, with a political ideology of socialism, of communism, of collectivization, redistribution, things of that nature. So around that time, around the time of the 1920s, you had the Ukrainian nation who was suffering from that. They were going through perilous circumstances because they had a famine. They had a famine around the time of the 1920s and then around the time of the 1930s, Ukraine and Kazakhstan. Because, of course, within the Soviet Union, they were practicing socialism, in which there was a lot of collectivization going on, in which you would have farmers that would grow crops. It would go back to the bureaucratized Soviet Union within in which the capital was Leningrad, in which from there they would redistribute the resources. But unfortunately, the people within the Ukraine and Kazakhstan and various other countries or republics within the Soviet Union, they were suffering. They were suffering for that matter. So within the Soviet Union, you had a lot of problems going on, especially around the time of the Cold War, in which you had the United States, which supposedly represents liberalism and democracy, the free market and things of that nature, against Soviet Union, which was more so of, like I said, a socialist nation based on collectivization, based on redistribution and things of that nature. But of course, with that largely bureaucratized nation, you had a lot of other nations which were outside of the imperial center of the Soviet Union who weren't benefiting from that. And not only that, you had the nuclearization of the Soviet Union and the United States with the arms races going on. So then within the arms races, you have proxy wars going on, globally speaking, geopolitically. If you want to speak about different parts of Africa during the decolonization movements, if you want to speak about Latin America, the Caribbean, but I won't, and also Europe and Asia for that matter, but I'm not going to get into the complexities and details of it all because I would like to stay congruent, but just giving you all background knowledge. So with a lot of that going on, you had centuries later, with a lot of that going on, you had the disintegration, you had the division of the Soviet Union because it eventually imploded. And imploded on itself. You had Gorbachev, who tried to implement the program of perestroika, which was leading to the liberalization and the privatization of the Soviet Union, in which they were trying to align themselves more so with the United States and end the Cold War. But in 1991, that was when it imploded. Now people are asking, why are you talking about Russia and the Soviet Union when we're talking about the Ukraine? Well, in order for us to have a proper understanding of the conflict that's going on in the Ukraine, then we need to speak about the Soviet Union or Russia, because the Russians and the Ukrainian people have a long historicity with one another as it relates to their turbulent relationship. Now let me get back to the subject matter at hand. On July 16th, I believe, in 1990, that was when the Ukraine declared its independence. It declared its independence as a nation state, for that matter, as a country, because they didn't want to be aligned with the Soviets. They wanted to have their own autonomy, their own sovereignty, their self-determination, their own freedom to exercise whatever rights or requirements there are as their own nation state, to determine their own destiny. So around the time of the dismantling of the Soviet Union in 1991, that's where you had a referendum that occurred, and that's where you had the Declaration of Independence for the Ukraine become officiated, and then eventually that was when they had their own nation state. Now, the economy started to become better, but of course, if you want to take it back to the Soviet times, and even now, they always had a turbulent economy in which unemployment was very high. Unemployment was and is very high, in which you have prices that are very high, and people that just want to have the resources that they can have in order to earn a living. So, of course, within the Ukraine, like any other nation, it's very challenging. It's very challenging once you're a new autonomous nation state. Whether you talk about the Ukraine, whether you talk about the other nations that were part of the Soviet bloc, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all of them countries. So, if we want to fast forward the Ukrainian history, in 2004. That was when we had elections between Yanukovych, who was recently the ousted president of the Ukraine, who was ousted not too long ago, and someone by the name of Yushchenko. So during their presidential elections, and let me give you all an aside for that matter, Yushchenko was backed by the United States. According to some of my sources that I've read, the United States, the State Department funded millions of dollars in order to get Yushchenko into office. So during the elections, Yushchenko won the elections by, a few percentages, and this caused a lot of issues within the Ukraine because the favorable candidate was, of course, Yanukovych. So we had the Orange Revolution, which was during the latter part of 2004, where you had the Ukrainian people protesting and agitating against Yushchenko winning the election, which was considered to possibly be corrupt. So this was going on from the latter part of 2004 to 2005, in which you only had one casualty, not that many casualties, or one recorded casualty. So eventually things began to change, and Yanukovych was recognized as the president of the Ukraine. And then eventually you had Tymoshenko, who became the vice president, the female vice president. But years later, there started to become some acrimoniousness or bitterness between Tymoshenko and Yanukovych. And Tymoshenko was a female vice president, not vice president, prime minister. So what happened was they ran against each other. They ran against each other in the past elections, and of course Yanukovych won. But what Yanukovych did was accuse Tymoshenko of corruption, and then eventually she became incarcerated. So to fast forward it, with the troubling economy, with turbulence going on within the Ukraine politically and economically, that was when the European Union offered to help the Ukraine and also to become more so inclusive with the Ukraine by granting them membership, while at the same time Vladimir Putin of Russia, the prime minister of Russia, offered $15 billion in Ukrainian debts and also cheap crude oil. So there's a dialectical conflict of interest, because with the European Union, that is a supra-political and economic entity for the purpose of unifying and unionizing Europe, for that matter, specifically Western Europe, but intentionally the whole Europe, so that it could become allies with the United States to spread democracy and free market and things of that nature, all these ideals throughout the continent of Europe. So, with that going on, that's dialectical to Russia, because even though Russia is not the Soviet Union anymore, there's still remnants of Soviet influence within Russia. So of course, with that going on, you have protests going on, because what Yanukovych did, Yanukovych's Ukraine is actually an ally of Putin's Russia. He declined the offer from the European Union and instead was loyal to Russia. So what that did was cause a lot of agitation and arrest within the streets of Kyiv, which is the capital of the Ukraine, in the Maidan Square, which is the Independence Square, which is the main location, similar to Tahrir Square in Egypt, where you had a lot of the agitations and protests during the so-called Arab Spring years ago. Well, we have Maidan Square right now, which is actually the center or the epicenter of protests during the Orange Revolution back in 2004, 2005. So we had a lot of unrest going on, and also, according to some of my sources, the United States is somewhat responsible for militarizing and also training some of the agitators within the Ukraine right now, who are actually fighting against the government. So what happens eventually is you have Yanukovych, who was ousted out of office, and now you have a warrant for his arrest. So he escaped the Ukraine and went into southern Russia in order to seek help from the Russian people, should I say the Russian government. So what the Russians did was actually this. They sent or deployed 16,000 troops into a location called Crimea. Crimea is another autonomous republic, and to give you all background knowledge on Crimea, Crimea was a part of the Ukraine. And it was a part of the Soviet Union, of course, but also a part of the Ukraine, because Ukraine was in turn a part of the Soviet Union. And Crimea has the Black Sea Fleet. Now, the Black Sea Fleet, if those of you all who may not know, is the gateway for economic trade throughout the world, globally speaking. So it's a very geopolitical and geostrategical location for the Ukraine and also for Russia. Now, the Russians deployed 16,000 troops within that region in order to protect that area because, to give you all background information, in 2010, Yanukovych, Ukraine, and Putin's Russia, they signed an agreement within 2010 in order for the Russians to have control within that area going up to around 2047. Some sources say 2042, some say 2047, but I suggest for you viewers to look it up so that you all could ascertain and accumulate as much knowledge as possible about what's going on within that region. So, according to the Russians, what they wanted to do was protect what was theirs as far as geopolitically speaking. But according to the West, or should I say according to the Americans, it's considered to be an invasion and occupation, which is considered to be antiquated or anachronistic within history, because the United States don't want to go back to the Cold War era in which you had both sides being inimical to one another, in which the conflict in the Ukraine and Crimea would be considered a proxy war. The United States don't want to go back to that. But according to the Russians, what they want to do is protect what is theirs. Now, to give you all background information on Crimea. Now, Crimea used to be occupied by the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, of course, was disintegrated after the Treaty of Versailles and World War I and things of that nature. Now, the Ottoman Empire, as we all know, was involved in the slave trade. Of course, not the African slave trade. I'm talking about the slave trade going on within that region, in which you had the brutal slave trade within the Eastern Slavic region. So there was a treaty signed, the Treaty of Kujic-Kanarji, back in 1774, if I'm not mistaken, in which it was around the time of the end of one of the first Russo-Turkish wars. During that time, in which the Ottoman Empire would basically stop colonizing and occupying the areas, especially as it relates to the slave trade. And then that area of Crimea became occupied by the Russians, and that's going back to 1774. Now, to fast forward it to the Soviet times, or should I say 20 or 30 years ago, you had another referendum in which the Crimean people were to determine if they were to be a part or aligned with the Soviet Union, or if they were to have their own nation. But eventually, during that referendum, there was a lot of complications and ambiguities, for that matter, and the area of Crimea, since the Soviet Union was dismantled, became a part of the Ukraine. Now, let me take it back into history a little bit, into 1954. The premier of the Soviet Union was someone by the name of Khrushchev, and what Khrushchev did was make that geopolitical designation, that area of Crimea, become a part of the Ukraine SSR. So that area was Ukrainian, even though that area belonged to the Soviet Union by and large, that large Soviet bloc. So within Crimea, you have Russian troops within that area, and what the Russians are doing, they're threatening the new government within Ukraine or the new leaders of Ukraine, the political leaders after Yanukovych got ousted. What they're doing is threatening them, saying, you all are to not intervene within that area, and you all are to protect the Russian people, or not even that, you all are to get out of that area indefinitely, because they're not recognized as legitimate, because the last thing that the Russians want is for a illegitimate, ultra-nationalist, racist, fascist type of regime to control that area of the Ukraine and also Crimea, since the Russians have interests within that area. So that's what we see going on right now. So you have John Kerry, who's on his way, John Kerry, who's the Secretary of State and also who was a former presidential candidate back in 2004 against Bush. You have him going within that area to see if he could rectify a lot of the issues. So I'm saying all this to say that what we see going on in the Ukraine and Crimea, it has geopolitical implications behind it, meaning that the motives are, of course, economics, is politics, and also who's going to reign supreme within that area, and also who's going to bring about order, peace, consensus, and stability within that area, and within whose expense. Now, you have Kerry that says that we're not going into the Cold War days, but what we see going on actually is the former Soviet nation, or should I say Russia for that matter, who wants to protect its interests within that part of the world, that Baltic region. That Baltic region, and then of course the United States, who's trying to protect its interests, because there are United States oil companies who have interests within that area also. And not only that, you have a pipeline. You have a pipeline that goes through the Ukraine, which empties oil out into Western Europe, which is what a lot of people don't know. Now, Obama threatened to have economic sanctions within that area, and also the European Union too, because the European Union, of course, the influence and their allies with the United States. And Western Europe, they take 25% of their oil deposits from Russia. So, of course, they're talking about economic sanctions, but let's look at things holistically, and let's look at things from a geopolitical perspective. In order to understand what's going on in the Ukraine, we need to understand geopolitics. It's like a chessboard. It's like playing checkers, in which one wrong move that the Russians make or one wrong move that the United States make will be deleterious or detrimental for each side. So in closing, let's study and let's have a proper understanding of what's going on, and let's just not rely on one source of media. Let's compare, contrast, and have a comparative analysis, because what we see going on is more complex than what we see in the media, in mainstream media. So in closing, it was nice conversing with you all, and this is the Baruti Libre Show. Peace.